Okay, hello and welcome to today's webinar in which we'll be discussing sample size determination for counts and rates. We'll be discussing how to overcome issues like overdispersion, unequal follow-up, interim analysis, and sample size re-estimation. My name is Brian Fox. I'm a research statistician here at nQuery, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Okay, so now I'll just quickly go through the agenda for today's webinar. So I will begin by discussing counts and rates. I will discuss some of the common methods and tools that are available for the statistical analysis of these types of endpoints. I'm sure the majority of you will be very familiar with this area, but the hope is that this will ensure that everyone is very familiar with the terminology that I'll be using, especially since counts and rates analysis tends to be less common than means, proportions, or time to event analysis, for example. We will then move on to discuss some of the sample size determination methods which have been developed for these endpoints in recent years. This should hopefully give you an idea of the wide range of methods which have been developed for these endpoints and some of the areas that are under current development. And also we will illustrate some of these methods with some worked examples within nQuery. Then we will move on to discuss the area of group sequential designs for counts and rates. There have been multiple methods in recent years for this area, and we will once again show examples of some of these within nQuery. The final area that we'll be exploring is the area of blinded sample size re-estimation. We will discuss this in a more general context, then focus in on the internal pilot approach, during which we will explore an example in which overdispersion is present, and we will use a quasi-likelihood Poisson model to combat this. I will then conclude with a very brief discussion and conclusion, where I will highlight some of the points made during the webinar. Note that I will aim to conclude the webinar well within an hour. I'll try to leave time at the end of the webinar for questions that come through during the course of the webinar. But depending on time, I may not get to these, or well, maybe not to all of them at least. But I will make sure to reply to any questions which I don't get to by email. Also, if any questions do occur to you after the webinar concludes, feel free to send us an email and I'll give all the relevant contact details for doing this at the end of this webinar. Also, just before we move on, I should mention that today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to it, along with the slides for this presentation, will be sent out to you after the webinar concludes. Okay, so today's webinar is brought to you by nQuery, and indeed nQuery is the software that we'll be using to explore the examples for today's webinar. So nQuery is widely regarded as being a cost-effective and easy-to-use trial design platform, which can be an essential tool in optimizing your clinical trial. nQuery is known as the complete trial design platform to make clinical trials faster, less costly, and more successful. nQuery is one of the most widely used sample size and power calculation softwares available and has been on the market for well over 25 years. nQuery is essentially split into 4 different tiers, basic, plus, pro, and expert, with our base tier containing our fixed term trial designs, our plus tier containing our Bayesian trial designs and our fixed term trial designs, and our pro tier containing our adaptive trial designs, in addition to those in base and plus, and then expert containing our trial milestone prediction tool, in addition to all of the other designs. Okay, so now let's finally get into the statistical part of today's webinar. So what is a rate? Well, rates can kind of be interpreted in multiple different ways. Some people may think of it as being more similar to a proportion. But here, when we refer to a rate, we are referring to an incidence rate, which is some event which can occur multiple times over some period of time. For example, how many cars arrive in a car park per hour. When it comes to clinical trials, some of the more common areas that this type of endpoint will be seen is the area of chronic diseases, and in particular chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, so respiratory diseases, or asthma. And you can see that both of these conform to this type of data, where once you've had an asthma or COPD attack, the amount of time taken for you to have another attack is relatively independent to the time since your last attack. But there are other cases where things become a little bit more complicated. For example, where the probability of having a subsequent event is not independent from a previous event. Repeated hospitalizations is an area where this is commonly seen. For example, cardiac arrests, where a patient may have multiple cardiac arrests over a given period of time. And while you could use the Poisson model here, it is quite hard to argue that the amount of time taken between your fourth and fifth cardiac event is going to be independent of the amount of time taken for you to have your first and second cardiac event, for example. Okay, so now what is a count? Well, a count is very similar to an incidence rate in that we are counting the amount of times that a certain event has taken place, but instead of counting over a certain period of time, we are instead using a more abstract measure. For example, this might be the amount of lesions in an MRI scan. Instead of being interested in the amount of time taken between MRI scans, we are instead interested in the amount of lesions showing up within these MRI scans. So another area would be, just taking a single scan and splitting that into multiple different areas, and then counting the number of lesions within those, for example. And indeed, a kind of famous example of this type of endpoint would be from during World War II in London, where a statistician was asked to determine the location of V2 rocket attacks and determine if they were random, or if there was some pattern that could be used to describe them. And you can imagine this is quite important, as it would have affected the placement of military assets, for example. And so what the statistician did was to split up the area of London into many different smaller areas and use a Poisson distribution to determine the count for the number of rockets expected to hit in each of these areas. And he determined that it was effectively random. So the locations of V2 attacks was effectively random, which implied that these rockets weren't being strategically guided. Okay, so effectively both counts and rates can be thought of as being very similar, or the same in fact, just with the main difference being that a rate is per unit of time, but a count is per unit of something specified by the analyst. In practical terms, when one is considering a count, you're effectively still using a rate analysis, but just setting the time variable to be equal to 1. And this makes sense because effectively when you're using a rate, you have to worry about adjusting for the fact that the times may not all be the same scale, whereas for a count, you don't need to worry about this. So there are many different options available for the analysis of counts and rates. However, these can largely be split into two broad categories. So there are rates models and there are survival-based models. The rates models are probably the ones that you're likely to be more familiar with if you're a statistician. So these will be your classic Poisson or negative binomial models, where you have some underlying incidence rate, where you can clearly determine a certain amount of events have occurred per unit of time, which from a statistical point of view becomes the generating model for where events come from. So there is some, event rate per unit of time, and then these events happen independently from one another. Then we have our survival-based models, and these tend to be more flexible and are essentially just extending your classical time to event model from just being interested in the time to the first event, which obviously classically would have been death, to consider the time until the next event, and so on and so forth. So there are multiple different ways to frame this issue. One might just use a Cox regression for all of the first events, and then a separate Cox regression for the second events, and so on. Or you can use the Cox regression, which effectively starts after each event, and we can, modify the Cox regression so that each event affects the likelihood of having a future event, and not necessarily the survival. And so all of this kind of feeds into the idea of having different definitions for the effect size. So you may have your classical event rate or incidence rate, or in the context of survival models, you may have the gap time, the cumulative events, or indeed you can even have your time to a subsequent event. So many of these methods and effect sizes are very well known to most statisticians. However, recurring events often tend to be analyzed using very inefficient methods. For example, using Cox regression or logistic regression, or even a t-test. And these are all quite inefficient because effectively they are throwing away additional event data. And it is well known that this decreases efficiency and increases your sample size requirements. Probably the best known example of this is where someone dichotomizes continuous data, for example, turning a response score into a good or bad response variable. Or indeed, actually, if you're dealing with repeated hospitalizations, an example would be only considering the time to the first event, or just whether or not someone was hospitalized, in which case you are ignoring the information that any subsequent events can provide. When it comes to the t-test here, effectively you will be using a continuous approximation to a time to event variable, which obviously has many obvious drawbacks, and indeed doesn't allow you to account for the issue of unequal follow-up or over or under dispersion in your data. And I will discuss this more later in the webinar. I should mention here that our focus will be on the case where we don't have informative censoring and we have independent events. And by informative censoring here, I'm just referring to the case where, like for example, someone might have died, and so it's impossible for them to have a future event. So the event informs future events. So if you are dealing with composite events or within subject correlation, then there are multiple methods being developed for these areas, and I will discuss some of these later in the webinar. Okay, so here's just a brief overview of some of the considerations to be made when you're dealing with counts and rates. For example, how to determine your endpoint of interest. Should you choose the incidence rate or a gap time, for example. Also, how to deal with unequal follow-up in the case of a recurring event. In particular, how to deal with sample size determination for this case. We will also discuss this later, but in effect, the real sample size translates to the total amount of time that was available for people to have the event, which is a factor not only of how many people you have in your study, but also how long they were followed up for. So you can imagine that if people are being followed up for different periods of time, similar to a survival type analysis, then this may be difficult to incorporate into your analysis and sample size calculations. And of course, accrual patterns can also cause issues. So traditionally, these types of designs would have generally been follow-up driven, which is to say that we would have been looking for a certain amount of patient years of data, for example. But you can also treat this as an event-driven analysis, similar to survival type designs. And in this case, we would be looking for a certain number of events. Then, also as discussed, informative censoring may be an issue. The next consideration is one which I've already touched on, which is, can you assume that all recurring events are independent, or do you think that there is some effect of an event on subsequent events? For example, it's quite common for the first events to have their own effect or effect size versus the second, third, fourth, and so on, in which case you'll need to decide how to prioritize those events. So all of these considerations tie into the larger issue of how to choose the best model for the given design or data that you're dealing with. For example, should you be using the incidence rate or gap times? Is overdispersion present? Or do you want your results to be highly flexible? Or do you want them to be highly interpretable? For example, like should you be restricting your answers to hazard ratio, which might make it easier to illustrate to non-statistical team members. Okay, so here I have just included a table containing a brief overview of some of the common statistical methods for counts and rates. First here we have Poisson models, which is probably the most commonly discussed method. These tests include both Poisson regression and the single one-group Poisson exact case. And a foundational assumption in the Poisson model is that the mean is equal to the variance. However, there are multiple extensions to this model, like quasi-Poisson models, which can account for overdispersion, which is where the variance is greater than the mean. And while many of these methods are fine, some of them do use ad hoc methods to accomplish this, and so may have issues in relation to the type 1 error rate. Also, methods which account for the zero inflation case are available, which is the issue where if multiple zero counts are observed, then this can cause issues for inference. The negative binomial regression models then are a very natural progression from the Poisson models, especially in the case where overdispersion is present. And they deal with this through a dispersion parameter, which is basically just a parameter that defines the underlying gamma effect variable, which then assigns each subject its own underlying Poisson rate. I should mention that usually it is recommended to run a Poisson model on the data before running a negative binomial. The reason for this is just to determine the dispersion status of the model. So if the Pearson dispersion statistic is greater than 1, the model is likely Poisson overdispersed, whereas if it was under 1, then it is likely to be underdispersed. And in the case of the latter, a negative binomial model just would not converge. So you would need to use a generalized Poisson or a hurdle, like a Poisson-Logit model, for example, or a generalized negative binomial model, such as like a Waring negative binomial regression or a Conway-Maxwell generalized Poisson model. Also, if there are far more zeros in the response term, then it may be best to try a zero-inflated mixture model. But if no zeros are present, for example, as would be the case for a length of hospital stay, then use a zero truncated model. So, that just illustrates there's a lot of, options to take and a lot of complexity. Okay, so the Poisson and negative binomial are the two main rate models. However, from row 3 until row 6 here, we have survival-based models. All of these effectively take your survival model, so time to first event, and extend this to the time to all events. So the Anderson-Gill model is basically just a direct extension to the Cox model, where instead of the likelihood being defined by the first event, it is instead a function of all the events, which dynamically contributes to what is called the intensity ratio, which is effectively quite similar to a hazard ratio. So instead of being interested in the hazard between events, we are instead interested in the intensity of events. This method is quite attractive because it's quite flexible in terms of allowing the underlying base rate to change over time, and it is effectively dealing with the same type of situation as the Poisson and negative binomial models, where the events are independent from one another. It's also, I suppose, quite attractive because it boils the data down into one intensity ratio measure, which allows for very interpretable results between groups. However, it does still have the same drawbacks as the Cox model, such as a reliance upon proportional hazards. I should also mention that if you do have non-independence between events, then there are alternative methods for all three of these models that I've discussed. But the next two models, so PWP and WLW, can deal with the dependence between events, and in fact the WLW method can deal with multiple different types of events. So the PWP method is attractive because it allows each event to have its own underlying baseline risk. So the chances of the first event can differ to the chances of the second event, and so on and so forth. And there can be dependence between events. So once you've had the first event, that can affect how likely you are to have the second event. The main drawback to this method is that due to the flexibility in the effect size, you are effectively considering the effect size between the first and second events, second and third, and so on and so forth, rather than a global effect size. And so it's perhaps not as interpretable as the Anderson-Gill model, for example. The WLW model then is even more flexible than the PWP in that it considers the cumulative effect of each event. The main drawback of this is that rather than just making inferences based on subjects who had an event prior to a given event, for example, inferences about event 2 based on those who have had event 1, it makes inferences based on both those who have had the prior event and those who haven't. As you can imagine, this is quite counterintuitive. However, it is the price to pay for using this cumulative effect. There are also many other survival-based models, like for example, frailty models, which can incorporate random effects on the hazard rates, and then many other models, but I won't discuss those here now. But the final method shown here is the mean cumulative function. So this is essentially quite similar to the idea of a Kaplan-Meier estimate, where effectively you just have a non-parametric estimate for the number of events at a given time. Okay, so now let's move on to sample size determination for counts and rates. So the first point here is, I suppose, perhaps a pretty obvious one, but that is the availability of appropriate sample size methods for counts and rates is a bit of a hurdle to their adoption within clinical trials. Until relatively recently, there were rather few methods available for the more complex types of analysis for these types of endpoints. And we're relatively lucky at the moment to have multiple different adaptive methods, Bayesian methods, and more complex case methods available to us. A very important distinction to make here is one that I touched on earlier, but that is that the real sample size is based on either the total follow-up time, across all the subjects. For example, with incidence rates, if you have 100 subjects and they're followed up on average for a year, then you have 100 years of follow-up time. And note that the total follow-up time is not just a function of the sample size, but also of the amount of time each subject was followed up for. So this is why, if a subject's follow-up time depends on when they entered the study, then it's a very important consideration for their sample size calculation. Okay, and then the other option is that the real sample size can be based on the total number of events. For example, you may say that you require 500 different COPD exacerbation events before you can conclude the study, in which case the sample size becomes a function of how long it takes to get that number of events. However, I should mention that this perhaps isn't as common in practice. Okay, so just to quickly touch on the recent developments, I suppose until quite recently, the vast majority of sample size methods available were just based on the Poisson model, for counts and rates, like the two-sample case from Lair in 1992, or the regression-based case from Signorini in 1991. But what we've recently seen here are extensions to other types of models, other types of designs, and also other types of hypotheses. For example, the negative binomial model has seen a vast amount of work over the last 15 years or so. The Anderson-Gill model has seen lots and lots of work over the last 6 years or so, and also designs like crossover designs, adaptive designs, multi-arm designs. They've all been worked on quite extensively. And actually, in addition, many other types of hypothesis types are now catered for, like non-inferiority and equivalence testing for the majority of these models. So on the right here, we can see examples of some of these models and methods. For example, the 2014 paper of Zhu and Lakis, which extends the negative binomial model, and the paper by Yongqing Tang for negative binomial for non-inferiority and equivalence, in addition to the Anderson-Gill model. So the work of Tang in particular has been very important in terms of taking methods which are already commonly used in survival analysis and extending these to sample size calculations for counts and rates. So for example, if you want to have unequal follow-up patterns, unequal dispersion per group, dropout, or change the definition of the variance, then these are all options available under the methods that Tang has provided. I will discuss adaptive designs later, but essentially things like group sequential design, MCB mod, and multi-arm multi-stage designs have been extended from the continuous means case to the Poisson case. Okay, so hopefully that gave you some idea of the range of methods and designs available in this area. But now let's just take a quick look at an example of some of these types of designs. So here we have a real-world example taken from the Lancet Respiratory Medicine Journal in 2013. Here we have a combination therapy versus vilanterol for the prevention of COPD exacerbations. So assuming a two-sided significance level of 0.05, a control incidence rate of 1.4, so the vilanterol group versus the the vilanterol group, and then that would be 1.4 events per year or attacks, and then assuming a rate ratio of 0.75, so 25% reduction in the combination therapy group, an exposure time of 1 year, and here we have the dispersion parameter of 0.7. And also the researchers used a negative binomial model to account for this dispersion. And they found that they would require 390 subjects per group in order to achieve 90% power. Okay, so now let's have a look at this within nQuery. So this is what nQuery looks like. I assume that the majority of you are quite familiar with it, but for those who aren't, essentially the majority of designs and tables, as we like to call them, within nQuery look like this. So on the top left here, we have what we like to call the main table. So it's kind of an Excel spreadsheet type interface where each of these rows represents a particular parameter. The rows with white are generally input parameters, and then those in yellow are generally output parameters. When you click on each row, a help card will appear on the right, which will generally give a brief description of the parameter, a suggestion on what to enter for that parameter, and then a list of acceptable entries. I should also mention that we have this thing here called our home card, and in here we have a summary of the entire table, a brief summary of how to use it, and also a list of the references used in the formulation of the table. So this in particular is quite useful for anyone from today's webinar who wants to learn a bit more. Feel free to go to the references section. Okay, so yeah, I suppose now we'll get started into the example itself. So the reason that we're using this table is that it allows for unequal follow-up per group, and you can specify a different dispersion per group if you wish, and you can deal with dropout rates directly rather than performing a ad hoc calculation. So firstly, we'll replicate our original example. So we're looking for 390 subjects per group. So we have a two-sided significance level of 0.05. We have equal follow-up, which is the default here. We have an accrual period of 1 year. Oh no, sorry, we have an accrual period of 0. A minimum treatment period of 1 year. And we can set our recruitment parameter to be 0, since assuming all subjects are entered into the study at the start of the study. And yeah, then we can set our dropout rates to be 0, since we're assuming there's no dropout. And the group 1 event rate was 1.4, and we can enter in our event rate ratio of 0.75. And we can see that once this is entered, we get back our group 2 event rate of 1.05. So that's for our combination therapy group. So the group 1 and group 2 dispersion are both assumed to be 0.7. And we have a sample size ratio of 1. And now if we enter in our target power of 90, you see that we get back our sample size per group of 390 approximately, where the 389 is likely just going to be rounded up to 390 to maintain an exact sample size ratio of 1. So once this calculation is ran, you see that below here we get what we like to call our output statement. So this is just a verbal summary of the design itself, so the input and output parameters. So can be quite useful. In addition, we see that there are multiple different plots available, which show the relationship between power and sample size, for example, which is this button here. So that shows how sample size changes as power changes. And we have also the ability to plot other rows. So let's, for example, look at exploring the effect of changes in the group 2 dispersion parameter, because obviously we're more likely to have concrete information about the group 1 dispersion parameter, given that that's the control. So to do this, we'll press that button that I just pressed, and we'll come down here and specify the group 2 dispersion as our x-axis. We'll look at the effect upon power. We'll assume minimum value of 0.1, maximum value of 2. We'll go up in steps of 0.1. And we can see that when the group 2 dispersion parameter is 0.1, then we have 95% power. So if the dispersion is far lower than expected, but then if it's far larger, so up at 2, then we can see that the power is reduced to 77.5 approximately. So this kind of indicates that the power is relatively robust to changes in the group 2 dispersion parameter. Since, even if the dispersion parameter is doubled to around 1.4, we still have well over 80% power. Okay, so now let's have a look at the unequal follow-up scenario. So to do this, we'll just copy our column 1 values into column 2. And we can specify unequal follow-up here. And now we'll assume that our accrual period is half a year, so 0.5. And effectively now, instead of every subject being followed up for 1 year, and everyone arriving at the start of the study, a subject's follow-up will depend on when they entered the study. So as such, we need to change the minimum treatment period to 0.5 because, if someone entered the study after 6 months, then the minimum period of time that they would be observed for is half a year, since we want to maintain the overall study time as 1. Okay, so now if we go down and enter in our sample size ratio of 1 and our power of 90, you can see that our per group sample sizes are inflated to 464 per group. And this inflation obviously makes sense, since now instead of having everyone recruited at the start of the study and followed up for a full year, we now have the subjects entering into the study over the course of the first 6 months. And so we need to increase the sample size in order to maintain the same amount of follow-up time, or total follow-up time. Okay, so now let's go to this table here. So this is just the Anderson-Gill model. And as mentioned, this model is a lot more flexible since it allows the underlying baseline hazard rate to change over time. And it allows it to be exponential, viable, or even piecewise exponentially distributed. So now we'll just do a very quick example to show how the Anderson-Gill model can actually be used to replicate something very similar to the negative binomial model, which is essentially just using the exponential model in that it assumes that the event rate is constant over time. So here we can specify our test significance level of 0.5 and a two-sided test. And now we're going to specify our shape parameter to be 1, which is effectively replicating the exponential distribution. And now the event rate scale parameter effectively becomes the inverse exponential event rate, which is the same as the event rate defined by the negative binomial model. So here we can specify our event rate ratio to be 0.75. We can specify our event rate scale parameter to be 1.4, and we will once again set our accrual period to be 0, the minimum treatment period to be 1, the enrollment rate to be 0, and our dispersion per group once again to be 0.7. And we're assuming that there's no dropouts, so the dropout rate will be 0, and our dispersion obviously was 0.7. So we're going to be assuming once again a sample size allocation of 0.5, which is equal sample size allocation. And then if we have our 780 total sample size, we see that we get back our 90% power approximately. So this shows that, under the special case where the shape parameter is 1, we have, and also if we have the constant event rate, we essentially get back very similar results to the negative binomial model. And so now let's just have a very quick look at the Poisson regression model. I filled out this table already for the sake of time, but yeah, you can see that it's quite simple essentially. So I've put in the exact same parameters as our original example, except that here we are assuming a binomial distribution for our covariance in the, or covariate in the regression model. And we can see that we get a sample size of 387 per group when there is no overdispersion. So, our overdispersion parameter is set to 1, which is equivalent to no overdispersion. Just to mention also actually that it is relatively easy to convert the overdispersion parameter from Poisson into the dispersion parameter from the negative binomial and vice versa. So essentially the overdispersion is just equal to the dispersion multiplied by the mean total events in your study. Okay, so now I suppose we'll just move on. So just to quickly show that there are multiple other different tables available for the Poisson and negative binomial models within nQuery, like this table here, which allows you to vary the underlying test statistic. This table, which is just similar but for the negative binomial model. This table, which is the non-inferiority for the Anderson-Gill model. This is the equivalence type testing and the one Poisson case, and there's multiple other ones like crossover, etc. But I won't be discussing all these here. Okay, so now let's move on to the group sequential part of today's webinar. So, what is group sequential design? Well, it's relatively simple, and I'm going to assume that some of you might be already familiar with it, but a sequential design, so not just a group sequential design, but a sequential design is one in which information is analyzed within your trial at certain points. A fully sequential trial is one in which the trial, all data is analyzed as it comes in, and decisions or changes can be made at those points, whereas a group sequential trial is one in which interim analyses or looks are made after groups of subjects have been accrued or analyzed. So that's where the term group sequential design comes from. So at each of these interim analyses, a trial can either stop early or adjustments can be made to the trial, with the most common criteria for stopping early being efficacy or futility. And some adjustments will be sample size re-estimation, which we'll be discussing later. But the main issue that occurs based on this kind of design is that due to the fact that you're taking multiple looks at your data, you will naturally inflate the type 1 error, and so you need some method to account for this. So to account for error inflation. So there are multiple different methods available. I've just included some of the more common ones here in this table, but effectively the error spending method of Land-Metz is by far the most common. And so I'll discuss what that is on the next slide, but just to mention before we move on that the other methods shown here, so the Habital, Pato, Banksiatis, Unified Family, etc., they are used to some degree, but just far less common. And many of them are quite simple and easy to use, and some have their own benefits and disadvantages. So it's definitely worth taking a look at those if you want to learn more about this area. Okay, so as mentioned, we'll be focusing on the error spending approach of Land and Metz. So essentially, This uses a spending function type design, where for efficacy, we will be spending a certain amount of the type 1 or alpha error at each of the interim analyses, and then for futility, we'll be spending a certain amount of the type 2 error at each of the interim analyses. So the way in which this error can be spent can be done in multiple different ways. So there are multiple different spending functions that can be used to do this, with O'Brien-Fleming and Pocock being two of the more famous examples, but there are many others. And indeed, the formula shown on the top right here is just the the O'Brien-Fleming alpha spending function. And effectively, the alpha and beta spending functions work very similarly under the hood, and they can be either very liberal or very conservative, which is to say that they can either be quite liberal in terms of allowing the trail to stop early, should significant effects be observed, or they could be quite conservative in that the early boundaries will be quite difficult to cross, and so they'll be far more similar to a fixed term trial. So that's kind of seen on the right here in the boundary plot, where we can see if you cross into the blue zone, you'll be able to stop for efficacy, or if you cross over into the red zone, you'll be able to stop for futility. Okay, so what are the specific considerations to be made when you're using a group sequential design for counts and rates? Well, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the group sequential methods can be quite easily extended to the counts and rates endpoints. However, there are some additional complications that can arise when this is done. There are many methods which have been recently developed which counter some of these issues, and most of those are included in the references at the end of these slides. Okay, so the first complication that can arise is how to define the maximum information. So for the Poisson model, the normal approximation can be used, which is relatively simple. However, Grayling et al. have published a paper which includes an exact derivation for this case, but it is relatively complex. For the negative binomial case, things do become a little bit more complicated, since the maximum likelihood estimator depends on the sum of the per subject follow-ups, the rates, and the dispersion, where the latter two will need to be estimated. And in addition, the total follow-up at a given look will need to be clearly defined, which can introduce other issues. And once these three pieces of information are combined in order to create our maximum likelihood estimator, which essentially becomes our drift parameter, then this is still not a closed form solution. So effectively, we still need to perform a summation over it. And obviously, this isn't too difficult to do, but it's just a little bit more complicated than the means or proportions case, where you have a standardized Z statistic. So this leads into the issue of how does one properly time the interim analyses. For the Poisson case, it's not too difficult to do, assuming that you have no overdispersion, since essentially you just continue until 500 years of follow-up time or total follow-up time has been accrued, for example, or if you're doing an event-driven analysis until you've observed 100 events. So for the negative binomial case, since the information at each look depends not just on the follow-up, but also on the estimated rates and dispersion, then we can only estimate the time at which the interim analyses will occur. Obviously, this introduces a lot more uncertainty. Some methods include Bayesian approaches to deal with this uncertainty, and also might include an independent data monitoring committee. But it definitely remains a very large complication when compared to your usual means or proportions group sequential design. So in practice, I suppose there are multiple methods which can account for an interim analysis occurring at a slightly different information level than was pre-specified. For example, you can just use simulation to explore the effects of this. So perhaps it's maybe not as large a barrier as you might think. Okay, and then finally, just to mention that there is a potential extension to the unblinded sample size re-estimation promising zone design for counts and rates endpoints in the works, but it's not ready quite yet, as far as I'm aware. But we will be seeing a blinded sample size re-estimation approach in just a minute. Okay, so now let's take a look at an example. So here we're just going to be extending our previous example to a hypothetical group sequential design. So here we are going to be assuming that there is just one interim analysis. So there's two total looks, including our final look. And we're going to be using an O'Brien-Fleming efficacy spending function. So for our efficacy bounds. And then we're going to be using a Huangshi-Dekani beta spending function with a -2 gamma parameter for the non-binding futility boundaries. So that is to say that we do not have to stop for futility if they are crossed. Okay, so now let's have a look at this within nQuery. So we will be using this table here. So a group sequential table is just a little bit more complicated than our previous tables, where down on the bottom left here, we have two additional tables. So on the left, we have what we like to call our group sequential input parameters. So these are kind of the parameters that go into the group sequential part of the calculation. And then on the right, we have the majority of our group sequential output parameters. Okay, so now we'll just quickly run through this since it's nothing too complicated. So we're going to be assuming a significance level of 0.05 in the one-sided case, since a one-sided analysis is probably more appropriate if you have any inclination about the direction of your effect, especially in the group sequential setting. Okay, and then we are going to set our accrual period to be 0 once again, and we can ignore our accrual speed parameter. Our minimum follow period is 1. Our group 1 event rate was 1.4, and our event rate ratio is once again 0.75, and we can set our dispersion parameter to 0.7, sample size ratio of 1, and now before entering in our power, we'll go down here and enter in our group sequential parameters. So we're going to have a total number of looks of 2. We're going to be using an O'Brien-Fleming spending function, which is the default, and then we'll be using a non-binding Huangshi-Dekani futility boundary with a -2 gamma term. So now we can return up here and enter in our power of 90%, and we can see that, oh yeah, this is ignored, so we can set that. And we can see that we get a sample size per group of 405, which is only an increase of 309 compared to our original example, which could kind of be thought of as the cost, or sorry, an increase of 15, I should say, which is kind of like the cost of the additional flexibility of this group sequential design. So having the ability to stop at this interim look. And I should say that at this interim look, essentially what we would be analyzing is whether the maximum likelihood estimator is between this 2.96, which is our efficacy boundary, and this 0.4, which is our futility boundary. So if it was above 2.96, we'd stop for efficacy. If it's below 0.4, we could choose to stop for futility. And as mentioned, the timing of this interim analysis will be quite difficult since it's dependent upon the event rates and also the follow-up time and the dispersion. So that's a significant complication here. Okay, so hopefully that kind of just showed that this is a relatively simple calculation to conduct, especially kind of within a software like nQuery. But now let's move on to take a look at blinded sample size re-estimation. So blinded sample size re-estimation essentially just uses interim data or blinded interim data in order to inform us about a nuisance parameter. So the fact that the data is blinded obviously reduces any regulatory or logistical issues, and it is a quite well understood and quite well adopted method in practice in clinical trials. The specific method that we'll be focusing on is the internal pilot approach, where the re-estimated sample size is going to be based on a parameter estimate for a nuisance parameter based on the internal pilot data. So this can have a small error inflation effect, but it's usually quite negligible, but that is definitely something to be aware of. So this is the particular example that we'll be looking at. Oops, my apologies. So this is just the example we'll be using. Once again, this is a completely hypothetical example. It's just for the sake of illustration. So now, instead of assuming a dispersion parameter of 0.7, we're going to be, oh, my apologies. We're going to be assuming an over-dispersion parameter of 1.3. So that will be the expected over-dispersion parameter. And we are going to be assuming that our interim pilot data is up to a total follow-up time of 100. And we'll be using this internal pilot data in order to inform us about our nuisance parameter, which will be the over-dispersion parameter. And we will see that the internal pilot over-dispersion parameter estimate will turn out to be approximately 2. Okay, so yeah, I know I've moved through this quite quickly. I'm just aware of time, but we'll just have a quick look at this within nQuery. So this is what blinded sample size re-estimation kind of looks like within nQuery. We can see that on the top left here, essentially a lot of these parameters are similar to our previous examples, but the main difference is that down here, we have 2 additional tables. On the left here is just a summary of our internal pilot data, and on the right here is our internal pilot data itself. So I've just simulated this within OR and included it here, but we can see that our over dispersion parameter estimate is roughly 2 as compared to what we expected, which was 1.3. And we can see that the total follow-up time at this internal pilot was 100. And a result of this data is that our re-estimated total sample size is now 855, rather than the initial total sample size of 650, which makes sense because obviously the over-dispersion parameter going from 1.3 up to approximately 2 implies a very large increase in the variance, which obviously causes a reduction in power or increase in sample size. Okay, so that kind of just shows it's very simple to do this type of analysis. Obviously, some of this does take a bit of understanding, but it's nothing too complicated. Okay, so now I suppose I'll just quickly wrap up. So I suppose the most important point to note is just that counts and rates are related endpoints for recurring events, but these recurring events are often ignored in practice just through simplified analysis. For example, just like using a survival-based analysis, which is obviously not desirable since it's throwing away a lot of informative data. Not only does this increase sample size very often, but it also unnecessarily needs to be done, as there are many different potential models available for these endpoints, like Poisson, negative binomial, and Anderson-Gill. In terms of sample size methods, there has been a huge amount of work done in this area over the last few years, including additional non-Poisson related models, which can accommodate unequal follow-up, unequal dispersion per group, and many other complexities. So group sequential theory is an area that is actively being worked on and has had huge strides made within it in recent years. And given its importance in terms of being the most commonly use type of adaptive design and is likely to only be worked on more in the future. So we also saw that there are some additional complications that arise with group sequential designs for counts and rates. However, that many of these methods, there are multiple methods available which can combat a lot of these issues. And indeed, we saw that blinded sample size array estimation is relatively simple to perform for these types of endpoints. Okay, so I know I've gone through a lot of that quite quickly, but hopefully that was useful to everyone. Apologies for the rush at the end, but if you do want to take another look at anything that you've seen today, do feel free to go to this link here, statsels.com/trial or nQuery-trial, and you can get a free trial of the software. Okay, so also, if you want to get in contact, feel free to get in or to use this email here, info@statsels.com, or do you want our website at statsels.com. Okay, so thanks so much for listening, and goodbye.